Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Communist Russia A-level history topic guide. This one going to be covering 1922 to 1953, the period of reign of which Stalin had control of Russia. Before we get into Stalin himself, first of all we need to take a look at Lenin's testimony, and in this it was produced in December 1922 by Lenin after he was partially paralysed after suffering a stroke. He dictated his testament. This testament included an opinion on all of the fellow Politburo members, and in which he was very particularly critical of Stalin, who on one occasion had actually insulted his wife and had suggested his removal from the post of General Secretary, of which Stalin held at the time. However, other members of the Politburo were more afraid of Trotsky, who was kind of like the co-leader in the October Revolution of 1917, but and Civil War hero as well he was known as. So they all decided not to read his testimony out, as Trotsky had a major say in it and didn't want kind of any bad kind of knowledge be put out on any of the members. With this being said, Stalin wasn't even kind of considered in the picture, and if he had been considered in the picture for leadership, then this kind of incriminating testimony would have definitely been written out. But as a result, it wasn't, and there was a huge power vacuum over the time, and Stalin kind of was able to influence his way in. But the main kind of battle was between Trotsky and Stalin at one stage. There was other people such as Bukharin and Mendeleev, but these were the two main contestants at one stage for the leadership. So we'll be focusing solely on them. AQA only covers these two in the book, so that's the only ones that we're going to go over. But Trotsky, compared to Stalin, Trotsky was charismatic, a brilliant orator, and also intellectually gifted. Stalin, on the other hand, was methodological and unspectacular, quite normal really. You wouldn't really expect him to come to leadership, as even though he was general secretary, he was only recently promoted to that point. So no one would have really kind of expected a further movement up the ladder of leadership for him at that time. However, Trotsky, on the other hand, was criticised the decline of internal party democracy, of general debate, and discussion within the party. The growth of bureaucracy and the tendency to make appointments on the basis of loyalty rather than merit. That was kind of an issue with most of the party members, due to the fact that they wanted to be kind of known for being loyal Bolsheviks rather than whether they actually deserved their positions and kind of the attention that they got. Stalin, on the other hand, used his position as General Secretary to appoint his own supporters to key positions, whereas Trotsky was potentially offending his supporters. Stalin decided that he was going to bring in his own people, and they owed him their place, so he kind of guaranteed their support in the vote and the kind of party, almost as blackmail, but not really, just due to the fact that they owed him what was due. Trotsky, one of the major factors in Stalin kind of getting an upper hand over Trotsky was the fact that Trotsky was absent from Lenin's funeral because he was away recovering from an illness, and he was also misled by Stalin himself about the date of the funeral. So Stalin took the opportunity to deliver an oration and praised Lenin almost to like godlike standards, and committed himself as kind of Lenin's disciple to carry on his work. There was two major kind of differences between them, which are the last two, and it's people's opinions of them and also what they believed in. What they believed in, on Stalin's kind of point of view, was socialism in one country, whereas Trotsky and Lenin beforehand had kind of believed in revolution worldwide. Stalin was very sold on the socialism in one country, that Russia could be a socialist state without external help. This allowed him to kind of shame Trotsky in the way that saying that they didn't need to depend on other countries and they could do it themselves, rather than kind of waiting for the resolute of the World War to kind of kick in a socialist revolution. Stalin also reminded the party members that Trotsky had been a Menshevik up until 1917, which was a kind of incriminating factor in it due to the fact that Trotsky wasn't really a true Bolshevik per se, even though he'd led the revolution and civil war. It wasn't enough in Stalin's eyes, and the fact that his past as a Menshevik was quite incriminating, as he was actually against what Lenin said at one stage. Trotsky, as we've discussed, believed in a permanent revolution, and as Russia only has a small working class, it needed the support of the working class in more industrialized countries to do this. Therefore, Russia should actively work to encourage socialist revolution abroad. But with that being said, it was pretty much impossible due to the fact that economies were recovering after World War One, not so much as World War Two, but Germany in particular, one of the closest, well not closest, but geography closeness to Russia, was nowhere near what they needed, and the countries that they would have needed, like America and UK, wouldn't have come close to any kind of deal or kind of any kind of revolution in their countries, as they had currently just won the war, so nothing needed to be changed. People's opinions on Trotsky were that he was arrogant, aloof, and dangerously ambitious. They believed that he might become too dominant, which would have made it a dictatorship rather than a kind of a democratic party, one state to rule. However, this was exactly what Stalin did during his time, even though people had absolute no idea of it. Even though he was politically astute, people underestimated his political skill and ambition until it was too late and he actually took charge. Stalin himself was able to control the party machine due to the fact that he could deliver the votes in decisions in the Central Committee or the Politburo. This meant that he led Trotsky to being forced out of his position as commissioner for the war in 1925. 2 years later, he was expelled from the party, and in 1929, due to mass vote, he was deported in the end. Stalin maintained an extended Lenin system of one-party rule, and also very much centralized control. Stalin was particularly keen to assert his own personal dominance, and meeting of congresses were held less often, due to the fact he didn't really, it wasn't that he didn't care, but he just didn't want to know what his party wanted, due to the fact that he was making it more of a autocratic kind of rulership that they needed to achieve socialism, as he thought. He did this because, as says General Secretary, Stalin controlled major appointments in the party, and he ended up making kind of a bureaucracy of loyal servants to him, due to the fact they all owed him the position, and ended up kind of getting on side so they could support him at a later date. He also benefited from the huge increase in party membership in the 1920s and early 1930s. Most new members were younger and less well educated, therefore making them more kind of easily supportive of the Stalinist regime rather than other options at time. They knew that loyalty could benefit them and their families, and most became reliable supporters of the Stalin dictatorship, just due to the fact that they could get rewards for their loyalty instead of merit, as Trotsky was promoting. The 1936 Constitution was claimed to be the most democratic in the world, in Stalin's eyes, even though it clearly wasn't, just due to the fact that considerable autonomy to the regions was promised, but in reality central government control ensured there was little kind of autonomy in any of the regions. It also promised elections every 4 years, but yet again these were not contested. Only approved party members' names were on the ballot papers, so whoever was elected was the one who was chosen by Stalin anyways, so it wasn't really kind of contested affair. He promised civil rights such as free speech, but these were ignored as censorship was imposed once again. However, some elements of the Stalinist dictatorship were undoubtedly established by Lenin in the early 1920s. But Stalin was more of a personal rule, as in he believed he was above the party rather than Lenin acknowledged and knew that he needed the party to get the power that he had. A quick flashback to the new economic policy by Lenin was one of the reasons, like, we need to look at it due to the fact that we need to know why the 5 year plans emerged. But the results of the new economic policies were that economic recovery was led by an increase in the supply of grain and other foodstuff to cities. There was an end to revolts and civil unrest. But however, a big issue was that there was a revival of the kulak class, which are rich peasants who can afford to have other peasants work underneath them, and the emergence of net men, of which are traders and speculators. However, industrial production was slow to recover, because peasants began to hold back their grain as there were few consumer goods to buy. Grain procured by the government by the end of 1927 was 75% of what it had been in 1926. This was due to a kind of a grain strike by the kulaks, and Stalin, in reaction to this, ordered grain seizures and decided the solution to the grain crisis was to develop a large-scale farm of a collective type, and therefore the battle for grain had begun. This idea of collectivization was outlined in the 5 year plans, but in order to know what collectivization is, first we've got to understand what the 5 year plans are. In December 1927, Stalin announced the start of a 5 year plan, the first one, and he decided that the Soviet Union had to modernize to catch up with the industrially advanced states of Europe and also the USA. He said, and quote, "Either we do it or we shall be crushed." He was referring to the fact that people were modernising a lot quicker than Russia were, with arms, and also the tension that was building between World War One and Two. But this was only to be known afterwards by historians that this was the period of in between World War One and Two. But the countries of the world were sensing kind of the tension that was still arisen between the countries. Stalin promoted that the Soviet Union would become self-sufficient and defend itself by building industries. To do this, it would export grain to pay for the machinery and the expertise it needed from abroad. This, as a result, would build socialism in one country, and that is what Stalin set out to promote. In terms of industrialization itself, the 5 year plan set high targets for each industry, which were broken down into for regions and specific factories. So we set them specifically for kind of like, if you talk about the car industry, he'd have one for Ford, one for yada yada yada. And failure to meet these targets could lead to arrest, prison, or worse for those at the top of the chain of command in those factories. This pressure led to the people putting quantity before quality, and it was done to enhance the production figures, so to kind of like bolster what they had produced, even though it might have not been at the quality that it was before. Massive propaganda campaigns portrayed the plans as part of the revolutionary struggle to achieve the final overthrow of capitalism and make the Soviet Union into a great industrialized power, which is what Stalin was trying to do with industrialization anyways. So the propaganda kind of replicated and mirrored what he actually wanted to promote. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some of the figures for the products and the targets and how they are very very unachievable due to the fact that he believed that in a 3 year period after the 1928 production, that they could achieve almost double what they had beforehand, and in fact of iron and pig ore triple what they had in the year before. The emphasis in all of the first 3 plans was on heavy industry such as coal, iron and steel, also oil, machinery and electricity. In 1929, the targets for 1932 were revised upwards and kind of changed. None of these hugely ambitious targets were met. However, as you can see by the second and fifth column of the table, that there was masses of a kind of production, even though the targets were kind of like tripled during this period. The production was actually pretty much double of what it was in 1927. and electricity output was actually trebled by 1932. Huge growth was maintained throughout the 1930s. Consumer goods were neglected, while rearmament was prioritised as fear of the war was increased in the late 1930s, as kind of like the tension was building up around the European nations. Some of the developments were actually spectacular, such as the building of a huge industrial complex at the Magnitogorsk within a few years, and the construction of the Dnipropetrovsk Dam, which increased Soviet electricity production by 5 times when it was actually completed. Many projects were achieved at a huge cost of human life, however, mostly that of displaced peasants, which Stalin didn't have much of a regard for in the first place anyways, as you can see by the result of collectivization. But living conditions for Soviet workers also deteriorated, especially with the marked increase in the urban population. However, Stalin achieved his primary aim of making the Soviet Union into an industrialized power that was eventually able to defeat Nazi Germany in the Second World War, and actually played a very big influence in the outcome of the war for Europe in total, which is not really often recognised. Here are the dates for the 5-year plans. Not going to go into detail about all of them due to the fact that it doesn't say so in the AQA book, but these dates were very kind of set in stone for what they wanted to be, and you'll notice that some of them aren't 5 years. This is probably due to kind of the wartime effort. You can see with the third one, it's very war based, and then afterwards the rest of them are kind of 5 years completed. From the fourth onwards, it achieved the target of actually being 5 years, and for the seventh one actually 6 years. What was a big influence on these targets that were set during these 5-year plans was the Stakhanovite movement, which began during the Soviet second 5-year plan in 1935 as a new stage of kind of socialist competition. This movement took the name from Alexei Gregorovich Stakhanov, who had actually mined 102 tons of coal in less than 6 hours, which was 14 times the amount that he was actually meant to, on August the 31st in 1935. This kind of set like a milestone that Stalin was like, if one person can achieve it, everyone can achieve it. So he set the targets ridiculously high based on this person alone. Collectivization was a massive part of the 5-year plans. The main features of collectivization is the unification of several villages into collective farms with all equipment and livestock kind of gathered in one place for everyone to use. The procurement of grain to feed the expanding industrialized workforce and pay for the imports of industrial equipment. Basically putting the workers and kind of soldiers first, which was kind of the aim of war communism, but this is more direct for them. Thousands of party activists that were backed up by soldiers and secret police implemented the policy of forced collectivization for those who did not want to actually kind of participate. The destruction of kulaks in order to force the peasantry into submission. So if you take out kind of the rich people, rich peasants, the kind of ringleaders of their society, you end up kind of like wrestling the rest of the population into submission, and that's exactly what Stalin did. He also increased the control over the peasantry by the state by classifying all who opposed collectivization as kulaks, even if they weren't rich or kind of wealthy or any of the such. They'd be classed as kulaks and a part of the class warfare. By March 1930, over half the peasants had been collectivized and 90% of the land by 1939, which is an incredible feat by Stalin. However, the results of collectivization was massive opposition, people burning crops and killing livestock rather than hand them over. Many of the collectives were run inefficiently by managers who knew little of farming. There was a decline in food production, although state procurement and exports of grain increased. There was a famine in Ukraine in 1932, which led to over 3 million deaths alone, and some people even estimate that the total loss of life was 10 million of this policy. The Soviet Union did not recover pre-war levels of grain production until 1939, which was a good 10 years after this was put into place. Millions were driven off land, many into forced labour camps to build new industrial Soviet unions. However, Stalin had actually achieved his aim of feeding the industrial workforce and exporting grain, and there was also a massive destruction of the traditional peasant way of life based on the family farm and the commune and church. This is just a brief summary of collectivization. There's a lot of decent revision kind of videos out there, so I'm going to drop one in the description that is incredibly useful. There was also a big kind of class issue at the time with society, but the class is in kind of were the big issue for them. In order to create a class of society, the Soviet regime encouraged communal living, with families sharing kitchens and toilets. However, this meant private life was subjected to public scrutiny, with the interests of community seen as superior to those of the individual, especially the bourgeoisie, who were known as the class enemy. However, the attempt to abolish private life led to many to be able to hide behind a mask of conformity in order to preserve their own identity. And this is one of the reasons why the leadership was so keen to unmask potential enemies in the purges, because they were able to hide in these communities and not be able to actually see who was opposition to them. The October Revolution was intended to bring out the greater equality, and at first the workers and peasants took control of the factories and farms. However, harsh labour discipline was introduced under war communism, and working conditions only worsened under Stalin, with the imposition of a 7-day working week and longer working hours, whereas they'd been reduced under Lenin, and also under Tsar Nicholas II. Then, in the 1930s, bonuses and payments by results were introduced to increase productivity, rather than having a penal system where they'd kind of penalised everyone that was maybe not up to scratch. This was a system that actually decided to reward them, which was what some of these workers needed. And while the Stakhanov movement further contributed to the emergence of the elite labour with higher pay and better housing, living conditions in the countryside deteriorated dramatically during collectivization, while overcrowding and poor sanitation was a big kind of characterization of urban living at the time. Women, on the other hand, faced similar conditions of struggle, with Lenin and the Communist Revolution promising great opportunities for women, such as access to a job and help with childcare. Divorce was made easier and abortion was legalised, also under Lenin, but women began to work an increasing number of hours, and nurseries were provided, which kind of gave equality for women. However, most women continued to do most of the housework, while divorces were mostly initiated by men, due to the fact that kind of society had been that way for that long. It was kind of the trend that was still happening. Then there was a big turn in the Stalinist regime, with a falling birth rate in the early 1930s, and with soldiers needed to be produced and workers for the nation needed to be produced. Stalin began to extol the family, the traditional family. Soviet propaganda portrayed him as a father figure, and increasingly women as mothers rather than workers. Divorce was made more difficult, and financial incentives were offered to large families. Nevertheless, 43% of the industrial workforce was made up of women in 1940. Young people were also quite an issue in society for Stalin, due to the fact that he didn't know how to deal with them. Education was seen as crucial in building a new socialist society. From Lenin's time, free schooling was provided for all, combining math, science, Russian language and literature with vocational training still, and socially useful labour in order to develop the skills needed for a modern industrial society. Furthermore, universities and schools had a vital role to play in indoctrinating the young in a new kind of collective way of life. For instance, students were encouraged to inform on teachers and parents holding anti-Soviet views. Nevertheless, undoubted educational movements were made, and by 1941, about 90% of those under the age of 50 were literate. A young division of the Communist Party, later renamed and formed in 1918 as a Comstol, the junior section, the Pioneers, was established in 1922, and Comsol encouraged its members to assist the police, do voluntary work, and set up political clubs in order to instill socialist values. Membership could ease educational advancement, but and enhance job opportunities. But by 1940, Comsol had 10 million members, but not all young people became involved. Some preferred Western films, fashion, and music, which were largely frowned upon by the regime. Marx had described religion as the opium for the people. He used to keep the lower class quiet. And Lenin followed the trend as he recognised that most Russians were very religious, and he tolerated religious worship himself, even though he launched a campaign to weaken the power of the Orthodox Church. The religion wasn't the issue; it's just what it stood for him. The lands were seized, church schools were taken away, um, and monasteries were turned into schools, hospitals, and prisons. Many priests lost their lives. But under Stalin, the destruction of rural churches and the confiscation of bells, icons, and relics aroused huge opposition, and religious protesters were branded as kulaks. And by 1940, only 500 churches were open for worship, which is 1% of the number in 1917. So it shows how much were cracked down on by the regime and how much religion actually suffered during this period. Minorities was also a big issue, as in 1917 the Bolsheviks promised national self-determination for ethnic minorities. The Finns were opted for independence, but others were prevailed on not to do so. All the national minorities were separately represented in the Communist Party. With the abolition of Tsarist anti-Semitic laws, the Jewish language of Yiddish became more widely used. However, Stalin made the Soviet Union into a more centralized state, and from 1938, Russian had to be taught in all schools and became the sole language of the Red Army, which is kind of what Alexander III did with Russification, but this is kind of just an advancement of what that was. Soviet culture came under fire as the October Revolution led to a burst of artistic creativity, particularly in literature and poetry, which Lenin encouraged. However, Lenin also believed that art and literature should serve the people. But on the other hand, Stalin was even clearer that culture should serve a social and political role, above all, to promote socialist values. And in 1930, this came to mean conforming to the standards set by Stalin's artists. Those who did not conform were purged. He believed that writers were engineers of the human soul. Art was not about free expression, but about shaping Soviet society. He created the Soviet Union of Writers, which all writers had to belong to after 1934. And he insisted that all members should strive for socialist realism. They should ensure their work could be understood by the workers, and contained characters who should be socialist role models or easily identified as class enemies. Above all, their message should be optimistic and uplifting. And before his death in 1934, a writer called Maxim Gorky praised Stalin's first 5-year plan as something of the highest spiritual value. However, other writers were not so accommodating to this, and many were sent to labour camps or committed suicide due to the purges and they were coming under. Propaganda was a huge part of the Lenin and Stalinship kind of era, as they both appreciated the value of it, especially visual propaganda for reaching the masses and winning them over to socialism. Stalin in particular exploited posters, cinemas, and radio, and he was portrayed as the worthy successor to Lenin, as the hero and saviour of the Soviet people, a father figure guiding them through the years of collectivization and industrialization, with a promise of a socialist paradise to come. The image of Stalin was manufactured by the Communist Party machine, which controlled the media, Lenin had not sought to be an icon, but Stalin definitely did. He became the personification of the nation, and in this way he undoubtedly strengthened his power, and this was done due to the cult of personality. The ideas of purges aren't exactly a new concept in Russian history, due to the fact that it all began with Nicholas, but it became more of a political weapon under Lenin, due to the fact that in their first days in power, the Bolsheviks faced opposition and thousands of anti-Bolsheviks were sent to labour camps. During the Civil War, the Cheka implemented a Red Terror in order to destroy enemies of the people. Then, in 1921, Lenin issued a ban on factions in order to curb the criticisms of the government within the party. Stalin exploited all of these methods, but he intensified the element of terror and kind of harshness in order to consolidate his own personal power. In eliminating actual or potential enemies, he also included fellow members of the Central Committee, which Lenin had never done in his time. Following the suicide of Stalin's wife in 1932 and growing criticism from within the party and government, the speed of collectivization, Stalin increasingly feared that his closest would betray him. Over the following year, almost 1 million members were excluded from the party, and from 1934, Stalin began a systematic purge of senior members of the party and government. The main purges, 5 of them. In 1934, Kirov, a popular figure and potential rival to Stalin, was killed. Stalin uses as the pretext for the arrest of the members, of which he called the Trotskyite and Zenonov, Kamenov factions. Those purged were replaced with loyal Stalinists. In 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev and 14 were shot after a show trial in which they confessed to treason and in the involvement in the murder of Kirov. A year later, in 1937, several Bolshevik leaders and most of the military and naval high command were shot. In 1938, Bukharin, Rykov, and more senior Bolsheviks, together with Yagoda, the former head of the NKVD, were shot. And in 1940, Trotsky was actually assassinated in Mexico. From 1937 to 1938 onwards, the terror was increasingly directed at ordinary citizens. It became a method of government, and the population were encouraged to inform on hidden enemies. Quotas of victims to be arrested in every region were drawn up, like industrial production targets, and hundreds of thousands were executed or died in prison. Altogether, 1 in 18 of the Soviet population were arrested during the purges. One less well-known element of the purges was the campaign to deport national minorities, such as Poles and Germans from the regions near the Soviet Union's western borders. This was carried out mainly due to fears that people might join an invading army, and over 100,000 Poles were shot in the duration of the campaign. Stalin was able to achieve the aim of eliminating all of his targets. However, after he'd called a halt to the terror in November the 1st, he left most of the population frightened and bewildered. He was able to achieve the aim of eliminating his rivals, replacing them with Stalinists, and he was able to attain absolute control over the party and also the Russian population. Throughout Stalin's rule, Stalin had encouraged great reverence for Lenin and portrayed himself as the continuation of the work of his predecessor, almost as in his disciple, in a way. He identified loyalty to Lenin with loyalty to the party. Furthermore, by the late 1920s, he had succeeded in identifying his own authority with that of the party. He made opposition to Stalin appear like opposition to Lenin, the party, and also the revolution. Many of the key features of the Stalinist rule had been established by Lenin, such as one-party rule, the secret police, the use of terror, show trials, what we established in the last podcast. Stalin continued Lenin's class warfare, particularly directed against the kulaks and the bourgeoisie. In many ways, Stalin's rule was simply a more kind of full developed and repressive form of Lenin's highly authoritarian rule. However, the purges constituted a complete break with the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin's regime, and they led to the development of a highly personal form of rule. Stalin replaced the old Bolsheviks, whom he eliminated, with a new class of officials, the nomenklatura, who were completely loyal to him. They had no loyalty to the Bolshevik Revolution and its leaders. They were completely just Stalin's men alone. Their positions depended on him, as did the rights and privileges, the luxurious apartments, the plentiful food, the cars that came with them. They all belonged to Stalin and gave to them, so they gave him loyalty back. They were very unlikely to doubt or criticise their leader. The Party Congress, which met in 1939, was completely subservient to Stalin. Nevertheless, there were limits to Stalin's power, not in the least the thousands of officials on whom he needed to implement his policies. The impact of his policies in the regions could be moderated by local conditions, the effects of corruption on the case, the purges, and also by desire to settle old scores and fill the shoes of those who were eliminated. The Soviet Union's economy had undergone a huge economic transformation by 1941, before the start of the war. It was becoming vastly a industrialized urban society. The development of heavy industry and this meant that it enabled the country to withstand the onslaught of Nazi Germany. However, the production of consumer goods was neglected. Agriculture failed to recover from the crisis of collectivization, and it was still not producing as much grain in 1941 as it had done under the NEP. Society just before the war was that nearly all peasants lived and worked in the kolkhots, which were supervised by party officials. Millions of peasants had moved to the cities, become educated and benefited from state welfare services. However, food was very scarce and housing was very overcrowded. With the priority given to the rearmament from the late 1930s, living and working conditions became a lot harsher, yet the burden was not shared equally. Far from being classless, Stalinist society had becoming hierarchical, with the privileged elite of party and government officials, military and police officers, and some workers, e.g. Stakhavnites, were rewarded with higher pay and other benefits for them. On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in what was the largest German military operation of the Second World War. This was known at the time, and still is today, as Operation Barbarossa. Stalin, however, was taken surprise by this mobilisation, and his government was unprepared for war due to the fact that Germany had secured a peace treaty with Russia, saying that neither country would invade each other during the war. Stalin had a kind of brief idea that Hitler would back down on this, but also the fact that he had so many senior officers purged in the 1930s meant that his government was kind of run thin for this unsurprised attack, as the replacements weren't really used to their job at that time. Within 24 hours, 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and after 3 weeks, 1 million troops were killed or injured, and 20 million were living under German rule. It came to a point where there was a danger that the regime might collapse in the midst of defeat, as the Tsarist regime had done under the pressure. However, once the troops were aroused and mobilised, the sheer ruthlessness of a highly centralised regime was turned to an advantage, as they were able to kind of like order more controls and more kind of action to take place, as they had to go through less people to do so. So like, instead of having like 50 people to go through, they could have 5 or something like that, and just have all 5 of them agree, rather than have to get 50 people to agree. And this meant that there was a highly effective wartime government that emerged at the time. The war was conducted by a small state of defence committee, and Stalin put himself as military commander. However, he had enough sense to kind of leave his generals to direct military campaigns, rather than what Nicholas II had done during his time. Stalin's first wartime speech, because he took a 5-day break due to kind of insecurity and also kind of just non-faith in himself as a leader at the time. He kind of had like a nervous breakdown. But when he returned, Stalin's first time wartime speech addressed his brothers and sisters, not the more usual Soviet comrades that he'd usually call them. He appealed to them in the name of the motherland and to their sense of Russian nationalism, not the fact of the Soviet Union and loyalty to that or communism itself. And he kind of turned it into the Great Patriotic War. Hitler had hoped during the time that large numbers of non-Russian national minorities would rise up against Stalin. However, there was no widespread uprising, but thousands who had suffered in the 1930s did collaborate with the German forces. Stalin's response was to transfer over 1 million people from different ethnic groups, to different parts of the country that were far away from the German border, simply just because he suspected they were or might be disloyal. Ukrainians, Germans, and Czechs were among those who were uprooted and moved east. Thus the purges continued in wartime. Terror was also exploited on the front line. When Stalingrad was on the verge of defeat in 1942, orders that deserters and cowards or anyone to retreat was shot. This is kind of the order of no step back kind of thing. Like when Stalingrad was about to fall, anyone that just turned or even like took a step back in the direction instead of kind of pushing the Germans out would have been shot at the time. Within a few weeks, 13,000 were executed for such crimes, such as deserting the war and kind of cowards. Others who came under suspicion were returning prisoners of war in 1945. They were seen as potentially disloyal because they had been tainted by Western values while in captivity. And many of these people, after suffering like horrendous conditions from the Germans, were transferred directly to the Soviet labour camps. There was quite a big political impact of the war at the time because Stalin addressed the grievances of army officers by reducing the political commissioners attached to the army units. And he also backed down on what he said beforehand about rank and kind of society, and restored kind of special badges of ranks and officers, and kind of like to get an organised army instead of a socialist kind of valued army. Vast numbers among the armed forces were encouraged to join the Communist Party, so that by the end of the war, half members were from the army and navy. So they had a big following. Because the Bolsheviks recognised how important the army was due to the fact that they were the ones that helped secure the revolution in the first place to get them into power. They recognised if the army and navy weren't on the side of them, then the same thing could happen potentially to them with an uprising. Although nationalism was emphasised in wartime propaganda, Stalin declared that victory over Germany was a victory for communism over fascism, which kind of just means that even though he wasn't promoting kind of socialism itself as the thing to fight for, the propaganda was kind of like a background kind of like influence that it was the way of life that Russia had that was beating the Western way of life, rather than, well, especially for Germany, rather than the other countries, but it was more of a Stalin kind of propaganda technique. The idea of the People's War was played down, and the Great Patriotic War was hailed as a victory for Stalin and the great Soviet socialist system. And this was at the end of the war, so it was changed instead of patriotic to kind of like this socialist way is the way forward, and they defeated a Western value. By the end of August in 1941, Leningrad, which was previously St. Petersburg and then Petrograd, was surrounded and besieged. By October, German forces were on the outskirts of Moscow. 50% of the country's coal, iron and steel was in German hands. The fate of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. It required a massive military effort, but also the mobilisation of all available economic resources in order to halt the Nazi onslaught. Fortunately for the survival of the Soviet people, the economy had effectively been put on a war footing in the 5-year plans. The emphasis on heavy industry and armaments and the highly centralised nature of the system were of great value in organising the war effort. One of the greatest achievements was the huge evacuation of people to and the rapid creation of military industrial plants in the Ural Mountains, and further east, beyond the reach of the German forces. This was where the planned economy was triumphant, and where the revolution won the war, in the words of historian Orlando Figes. All of this, without state coercion, could never have been achieved in such little time, due to the fact that the system was kind of that centralised that it was able to happen. These are the reforms that the economy kind of put in place. Well, not the economy, but Stalin put in place for the economy. Thousands of factories were moved east or built anew. Nearly all industrial production was geared towards military needs, as you'd expect during any kind of nation during wartime. Railways were built to connect new industrial bases to the war fronts, to able to get like people quicker to the war front with kind of arms and raw materials that they needed at the time. Factories were put under martial law to tighten labour discipline and productivity. This isn't really a surprise with the penal system that was already in place, but very strict kind of conditions to make sure that the productivity was the highest that it could have been during the war, so they had more chance of winning the war. Alongside this, harsh punishments were given for poor work or lateness. A 72-hour week became the norm, which is quite staggering really, due to the fact that a 36-hour week is what we have in the UK, or possibly 40. I believe it's 36, which is actually double. 72-hour weeks are double what we have to work at the moment. Strict rationing was introduced. By 1943, industrial production actually exceeded Germany's, and that's considering that the factories that Russia had, some of them were under German occupation by this time, so that's quite a massive feat for them to have achieved. Alongside this, the USA provided thousands of planes, tanks and military vehicles, and 5 million tons of food to the Russians. Prison camp labour produced much weaponry as well as army uniforms. Prisoners could be and were worked to death, as you'd probably expect under the Stalinist regime. A similar disregard was shown for individual human lives in the army. Strategical goals were set no matter how many lives would be lost to achieve them. This is kind of a kind of key feature of the Stalinist regime, with like collectivization, like penal punishments in the kind of the factories, that the cost of human life doesn't really matter to him at all, and this explains why 8.6 million troops lost their lives in the war altogether. The cost of life on the Russian people was absolutely staggering and quite devastating for the country. Over 25 million lives were lost, mostly civilian, through starvation. Leningrad was besieged for over 2 years with no heating, no lighting or no water supply. 800,000 died in the city in the winter of 1941 to 42, which was more than the combined UK-US losses during the whole war in their country. Propaganda emphasised patriotism to drive the invader out of Mother Russia. Most people actually responded to this, ready to undergo extreme hardship rather than surrender. Most of them experienced and survived harsh conditions in the 1930s, and were prepared to do so again for the sake of a brighter future for Russia. With the countryside stripped of men, horses and machinery, four out of 5 collective farmers were women, often pulling ploughs by hand rather than kind of ox or kind of any machines. The churches were allowed to reopen and did much to raise the morale and support the war to defend Holy Mother Russia. Government propaganda exploited nationalist feeling, invoking memories of great Russian heroes as well as the Civil War. The war brought government and people together, and Stalin emerged as the nation's saviour, held in even greater awe and fear than before. This led to the revival of terror and high Stalinism, due to the fact that most of the Soviet people had made huge sacrifices during the war in the hope of securing a better future. This wasn't achieved at all, due to the fact that their hopes were dashed. After the end of the war, there was a new enemy, the USA, and the Russians had to prepare for a new international struggle, which was later to be known the Cold War, and there would be no reform after 1945. Instead, the country had to be sealed off from the West, censorship was increased, and the NKVD was strengthened. Although Stalin's rule was stronger as a result of the victory of the war, he still feared rivals that he had in government. In order to strengthen his control yet further, he abolished the Defence Committee. In particular, he demoted several high-ranking army generals as a way of putting the military in their place. Marshal Zhukov, highly popular and therefore in Stalin's eyes a rival, was posted far away from Moscow. Stalin made himself the defence minister, and as he grew older, became even more suspicious of those around him. He dispensed with the Central Committee and the Politburo, thus removing any semblance of limitation upon his authority as he became a dictator. There was not another Congress until 1952. Stalin relied increasingly on his private advisors in order to bypass both party and government bodies and exert his own absolute authority, therefore making him basically the sole leader of Russia. There was no one that could actually overrule him, or even if there was a big opposition kind of party, they would not have been able to do anything due to the fact that he was riding on the wave of patriotism and like people's kind of fear and love for him saving Russia. Stalin revived the use of terror as a political weapon once again. The terror did not reach pre-war levels, but many thousands were executed every year for counter-revolutionary activities. There were two major significant purges after the war. First of all is the Leningrad affair. In 1949, Stalin turned on the Leningrad Party organization. Its leaders showed a strong sense of independence and solidarity, which was developed during the wartime siege. Two of the leaders were seen as possible successors to Stalin, and at this time he was now 70. This was enough for Stalin to have several arrested, forced to confess and shot. The Doctor's plot, on the other hand, was kind of an inbuilt sense of fear from the Cold War, as the Cold War bred an intense fear of foreigners. A Soviet citizen could be arrested for even brief contact with a foreigner. Stalin was particularly suspicious of the 2 million Soviet Jews. He had supported the new Jewish state of Israel created in 1948, hoping it would become a Soviet ally. But when it turned out to be pro-American, he became afraid of pro-Israeli feeling among the Jews and saw them as a potential threat. In 1952, Stalin announced a conspiracy by the Kremlin doctors to murder him and other Soviet leaders. 7 out of the 9 white-coated assassins were Jewish. Hundreds of doctors were arrested and tortured into making confessions. Then thousands of ordinary Jews were arrested and deported to remote parts of the country, where new labour camps were built to contain them. Anti-Jewish feeling was whipped up in the press, as it had done in many of the years of Russian history. And at the height of hysteria, Stalin actually died on the 5th of March 1953. Both before and even more so during the war, Stalin was portrayed as not only the leader, but the very embodiment of the nation. He was increasingly recognised, especially after the victory in 1945, as the father of the people of the USSR. Furthermore, Stalin the Georgian was portrayed as a great Russian, following in a line of heroes from Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and of course Lenin. Stalin's birthday became the biggest celebration in the Soviet calendar, with flags bearing his image like a religious icon, carried the procession in the Red Square in Moscow. This cult of personality reached its height after the war. Stalin was portrayed not only as a man of exceptional genius, but as a man of the people, ever present, ever knowing, and benevolent towards his people. On his 70th birthday, a giant portrait of Stalin was suspended in the sky over Moscow and lit up at night by the searchlights. When Stalin's death was announced in March 1953, prisoners in the labour camps may have actually rejoiced at the news. However, across the country, there was widespread and genuine grief at the time. There was also a lot of alarm at the prospect of a future without Stalin, due to the fact that he'd been Russia's saviour in the war, and in the years since he had represented stability in an uncertain world with the Cold War overlooming Russia at the time. Stalin was laid rest next to Lenin. Stalin had been increasingly frail in his later years as a leader, but he had made no attempt to prepare a successor. Instead, he actually did the opposite of this, due to the fact that he continued to play off his ministers against one another. He encouraged rivalry between the contenders for leadership, and so great was his fear of threats to his personal rule that he actually called a party congress in 1953. Speeches by members Mekhanov and Khrushchev announced that the Politburo would be replaced by a large presidentum. Some suspected that Stalin was actually preparing for another purge by raising up new members to senior positions. However, when Stalin did die, there was no clear successor to the head of Russia. However, three main contenders for the power appeared in the forms of Levantry Beria, who was the head of the secret police, Makarov, and Molotov. However, as you can see, Khrushchev wasn't actually one of the kind of main contenders. However, in the next podcast, we'll be looking at how he actually did get into power with his reforms and how he actually managed to kind of make himself look like the best leader possible. But for now, on Stalin, that is it.